Hey gamers, it's Wintermute here from Grind This Game, and this is a guide about cooling water. Easy ways, hard ways. I would say generally it's not that easy to cool water, especially if you want to get it down to like 25 degrees or so for bristle blossoms, or 5 degrees for sleet wheat, which is even more finicky. So I'm going to start off with some really basic ways to cool water and then try to get into some more intricate ways that have a few more requirements. So if you're lucky, you'll find a steam geyser in your map. You start off with quite a bit of starting water, but eventually you'll run out of that. And you could tap into polluted water and start filtering it with the sieve, which is under refinement. Water sieve. That requires sand and some power, and it'll output water at 40 degrees Celsius. So even if your polluted water is, let's say, 30 degrees on the map and you find pockets of it, the water sieve outputs at 40 degrees. And that 40 degrees water you'll have to cool down if you want to use it. But let's say you want to get most of your water from the steam geyser. I would recommend that you kind of cap off your geyser. Now, some people use granite, and if your geyser is far away from your base, granite might be okay, but what's going to happen is over time, the hot geyser water and steam is going to heat up the area around it, and eventually it might get to your base. It might kind of interfere with your plans. If you ever want to put a dupe in there, it might be too hot unless they have exosuits on. So a more typical thing, I'm in debug mode, so I'm kind of cheating here, but a more typical thing is to use abyssalite. And you don't need insulated tiles. You can use regular tiles as long as they're made out of abyssalite, which is a great insulator. And all the geysers have a bottom like this made out of neutronium, which is also a perfect insulator. If you look at the details, click on a tile, click on details, you'll see thermal conductivity 0. And abyssalite is almost 0. It's 1 times 10 to the negative 5. So it's basically a perfect insulator. So what is typical is to go like this. Something like this. We'll give it a bit more space. Draw a box around it like this. And leave enough room for a liquid pump. Now if your dupes are doing this, you'll probably want to leave some space, let them get in, build everything. Maybe use a door, but you don't need a door. Just leave it open. They might get a little bit burnt while they're doing this. And then set up an abyssalite pipe to get out, and also some power to get out. I'm using gold. And then you can cap it off. Then you can seal it up. That'll keep all this heat in here and prevent it from kind of heating up the surrounding area. You may also want to put in some automation if you have it available. I'll often put in a hydro sensor right in the bottom here. And I'll say something like activate if the pressure is above, let's say, 100 kilograms. That way the pump isn't like pumping all the water out until it gets almost dry. It'll leave a bit of liquid in there. You can also put this up one tile if you want to allow a little bit of water to accumulate. So then you'll have hot water coming out of your pump, and it'll be at eventually 95 degrees. Once this heats up and stabilizes, it comes out at 95 degrees. So then you have quite a few options. If you're using the water for lavatories, you can send in 95 degree water. And down here I've got a little bit of a setup. So I've got some 96, 97 degree water here, which is kind of simulating what comes out of the geyser. And we've got a gold pump in here. And I'm sending water to a bunch of places, and I'll explain all these things as we go, but I'm sending some of it up to this lavatory and shower. Now your dupes actually don't mind using the shower with 95 degree water. They're okay with it. Same with the lavatory, works just fine. But the water sitting in there will kind of heat up the lavatory and heat up the shower. So you may want to use some Wheeze Warts, which are these little creatures. I have one planted here somewhere. Yeah, these are Wheeze Warts. And they'll cool the air around them. They're pretty effective. They do essentially the equivalent of 12 kilowatts of cooling. So they'll suck in some gas, I think 5 kilograms of gas, and spit it out at a lower temperature. They're pretty good. If you use enough of them, they're pretty good. And they work best when they're in hydrogen, because hydrogen, if you click on it and look at the details, has a high specific heat capacity, which essentially means you can dump a bunch of heat into it or coolness into it. So it takes longer for Wheeze Warts to cool hydrogen, but it will retain the coolness for longer. So the pipe I'm using to go into my lavatory or my shower is abyssalite, so that none of the heat escapes out of the pipe. And the water that comes out is also going to be at 95 degrees, so you want to use abyssalite. So then you're going to have hot polluted water coming out at 95 degrees, which you can either dump in a kind of abyssalite tank to make sure all the heat doesn't escape. But a really good way to get rid of hot polluted water is the Fertilizer Maker, which is under refinement. Sorry, fertilizer synthesizer. And it takes in polluted water, and it doesn't really care that it's 95 degrees. It will destroy that polluted water and output fertilizer, as well as natural gas. So you want to build these in a sealed room. And they're a good source of natural gas if you haven't found a natural gas geyser yet. And natural gas is great for generating power. I've got a kind of a mock setup here where I'm getting all my power from. It's pumping natural gas into these natural gas generators. And I do have another video on that's a power guide that goes over all this kind of stuff, so I won't go into it much here. So the point was, you can use hot 95 degree water for quite a few things, like showers. I don't really recommend actually using showers because the dupes actually don't need them. That might change in the future, but the little grimy debuff that they get doesn't actually have a negative effect. But the toilets they definitely need. Lavatories are a bit cleaner version of the outhouse. And you're fine using 95 degree water. As long as you use abyssalite pipes in and out, that's good. But let's say you want to grow some of these bad boys, the bristle blossoms. If you look, they need a body temperature of between 5 and 30 degrees. And if you're using hydroponic tiles like this, which has a water input, if you send in 95 degree water, there's water that sits in these hydroponic tiles. Let's just see here. So hydroponic farm, you can see there's about 5 kilograms of water sitting in there. And I'm sending in cool water, but if you were sending in 95 degree water, this area would heat up, the tile would heat up, and then the air would heat up, and your bristle blossoms would stop growing because it would get too hot in here. So these require cooler water. And at the moment I'm sending in 26.7 degree water Celsius, which is kind of just under the max temperature of these, what these guys like. So the question becomes, how do you get water down to 25 degrees or 20 degrees to use with these guys? And that's what I'm going to talk about. Got a bit distracted there. So one way to do it is to pump the water coming out of the geyser room through an ice biome using Wolframite pipes. So if we go here, Wolframite is kind of special. Actually, we have some of it on the map here. It's found in the ice biome, and it has a thermal conductivity of 15, which is quite high, which basically means if you have Wolframite pipes, the hot water, the heat from the hot water will escape into the surrounding environment really well, as long as, assuming the environment is cold. You would take your pipe and lead it through the cold biome, and building something like a radiator like this. And the longer the radiator, the more cooling you'll get, and then you'll send it off to the base where you want to use it. So the water will come in at 95 degrees, and this ice biome is at minus 30 at the moment. So you'll send in your 95 degree water, it'll snake through these pipes, releasing its heat, and the ice biome will essentially cool down the water as it travels through. But it will also heat up this ice biome. So this is not a permanent solution, but it'll work for quite a while. Now this assumes you have quite a bit of Wolframite. You can also use granite, but it won't be as good as an effect. And you can plant Wheeze Warts around this area as well to try to cool it even more. An even simpler way, without building radiator, is just to take your hot water and dump it directly into an ice biome. So you could pipe it directly in and let it accumulate. I often like doing it near the bottom where you have a bunch of abyssalite naturally forming, which is 3 or 4 tiles thick so it doesn't break. So you could do something like, let's take some water at, let's say 380 degrees Kelvin and just paint some in. Oh, that was too hot. That was steam. Let me destroy that. Let's do it at 350. Paint that in. So what's that water at? It's at 72 degrees Celsius. Now, if you pump in small amounts of water into an ice biome, over time it will cool down. Oh, it's already down to 49. So it went in at 70. It's already down to 45, and it'll continue to cool. Normally you wouldn't dump in a whole bunch like this at once. You would be trickling it in, but the ice biome will naturally cool it down, and then you could pump it out of there to use it for plants or whatever, as long as it was cold enough. And you can set up regulation using something like a thermo switch, and say, you know, if the temperature is below 25 degrees, then pump the water. Otherwise, don't pump it. Now, another way to cool down a water tank is to build some mesh tile above it and then put in ice sculptures. So under furniture, there's an ice block. Now in debug mode, it won't actually build it. It will melt right away. But if you build them, the dupes will come along, use some ice from the ice biome, build some ice sculptures, and they'll cool the air around them, but then when they melt, the cold water goes into the water tank and cools it down. So that's kind of a temporary but manual way to cool water as well. Now this water is already down to 37. So those are 2 simple ways. This is probably the simplest way of all. Dump hot water in an ice biome. It'll cool down, but it's not a permanent solution because your ice biome will eventually warm up. But it might get you through 100 cycles, maybe 500 cycles. And once one ice biome is heated up, you could move on to the next, because the map usually has quite a few. And you can add Wheeze Warts to kind of speed or keep the cool things down even more. Now you can also use these under utilities. You can use a temp shift plate. Now you can make these out of granite. You can make them out of dirt. Diamond is one of the better ones. And if you build them like this, what they do is they essentially spread the heat out. So this water is hot, but this air is cool. So it's basically going to spread the heat out into this area faster. And if you put some Wheeze Warts along here, they would cool the temp shift plate and kind of send the cooling down this way, or extract the heat, whichever way you want to look at it. So temp shift plates are pretty good at spreading heat out. So now for a slightly more advanced way to cool water. So we've got our 95 degree water here, 96. You can send it in, let's say you have a bunch of carbon dioxide you want to get rid of. You can send it into a carbon skimmer at 95 degrees or whatever. And the polluted water that comes out is always going to come out at 40. So it's essentially destroying a whole bunch of heat, quite a bit of heat. But then you're left with polluted water, which is not what you want for bristle blossoms. You want clean water. So then you send that 40 degree polluted water into a sieve, water sieve. It'll clean it for you using sand, and a map has a ton of sand, and you can even make more sand. It's essentially unlimited in practice, and there's ways to generate sand that's more complicated, but there's a ton of sand on the map. You can also use, under refinement, you can use the rock granulator to turn certain minerals into sand. So that's a way to get sand if you happen to run out, but there's tons of sand on the map. So this uses sand. It gives off polluted dirt, which you can put in the compost. Or hatches can eat it for you and make coal, which you can use for energy. But the output of the sieve is clean water at 40 degrees. So you've taken 95 degree clean water and turned it into 40 degree clean water without too much power. This is only 120 watts for these 2 devices. You're going to need some CO2 for this thing to operate, but There's often your dupes are giving off CO2, and there's ways to generate CO2. A lot of power production, like coal production or coal power, natural gas power, they all give off CO2. So there's... Now, some people would say don't waste your CO2 doing this. Send your CO2 to slicksters, which are little oil-eating monsters at the bottom of the map. These little guys. And they would be right. It's a better use to get oil out of them, but if you need to cool water, this is a good way to do it. So then you take... Now you have 40-degree water, which isn't quite cool enough. And you can use some of the first methods that I talked about to bring it down to 20 or 25 or whatever you need it at. But then there's more advanced ways to cool the water further, so I'll show you that now. Now you can build a device like this, which is not quite the Borg cube. It's a name that the guy who created it, his name's Saturnus, and he posts in the clay forums a lot. So the pump sucks up the crude oil, it sends it into the aquatuner, so it's going in at 80 degrees and coming out at 66. And it just goes like this in a loop. Now the aquatuner gets really hot when it runs, but because it is immersed in this crude oil, it, in theory, it should heat up the oil an equal amount to what it's cooling. But the way the game mechanics work, it eventually cools down. So if we take a look at this oil here, it's at 79 degrees. Let's watch this one tile of oil here. It's at 81.5 degrees. Now let's speed things up. Control U is like super speed. Now you'll notice it's 81.1, it's 81, 80.9, so it's going down. One could argue it's exploiting some mechanics in the game that are broken, but not to a huge degree. So let's slow things back down here. So if you let this thing run for a long time, the crude oil would get cooler and cooler and cooler. Eventually it would get like down to 0 degrees and beyond. And oil freezes solid at negative 40. So you would want to put some regulation in using a thermo sensor. You'd want to immerse it in the oil and say, don't run this thing when you get down to about minus 20. The reason minus 20 is that the oil going through the aquatuner will come down another 14 degrees and it'll be close to freezing. So shut the thing off if it gets too cold, basically. Now, the tiles around this are abyssalite to kind of retain the coolness. But if you used metal tiles, let's say right here, or along here, actually along here, for instance, metal tiles have a high thermal conductivity. Let's draw a few here. If you click on them, you'll see thermal conductivity 60, which is extremely high. If you made metal tiles along here, and you had hot water kind of in a small tank here, this thing would get really cold, like minus 20, and it would cool down the water. The coldness would essentially suck the heat out of the hot water, and then you could cool it down to whatever temperature you needed. Another thing you could do is circulate this cooler oil through a hot water tank and cool the water down that way, using something like a Wolframite pipe radiator, like I showed you earlier. Now there's an exploit with this kind of system. Let's watch it. So we see it's really hot, but if we put a metal tile right here, watch what happens to the temperature. See, it's at 40 degrees, 30 degrees. Look how fast it's cooling. Now, we're not even through like a tenth of a cycle and we're down to 20 degrees. So this thing will basically cool down to a freezing point almost instantly. Look how cold it is already. And we're not at super speed, we're just at like regular speed. And what's going on is the cold oil is coming out and forming a tiny little droplet here. And the cold droplet, when it hits the big pot of warmer oil, cools down the whole thing. The way the mechanics of the math works with liquids merging with liquids doesn't take mass into account. So 1 gram of really cold water or oil can cool down a giant body. Like this you could have a giant body of boiling hot oil and drip in tiny amounts of freezing oil, and it would freeze the whole tank almost immediately. So this is the exploit. Now, if you like cheating, you can do this. If you don't like cheating, you can do something simpler like the kind of the original method, which cools but not at such a crazy rate. I should mention that the reason you use oil for something like this is that it doesn't freeze at 0 degrees like water. It freezes down at like I said, minus 40. Petroleum's even better. It freezes at an even lower temperature, so you can get your cooling thing down really far. Now, a non-cheaty way of doing this is to use either a bunch of aquatuners in series, and these things use a ton of power, but you can get essentially unlimited power in this game through using fertilizer makers plus natural gas power. I've got quite a bit of power here. So one natural gas geyser, for instance, will power 3 of these, and each of these is 800 watts. But then you can build an unlimited number of fertilizer makers, which can power an unlimited number of natural gas generators. You can also build petroleum generators, which take in petroleum and generate a bunch of power. So eventually you'll have a ton of power, and you can do something simple like this. And what I'm doing here is I'm just sending water, 95 degree water, through a valve, and I'm controlling the amount of water that goes through. Right now I'm just letting it all 10 kilograms per bubble go through. And so the water's coming in at 96 or 97, and it's coming out at 26, as you can see. And these things aren't operating at all the time. Oh, they just kicked on there. So what we're doing is we're sending that cold water to 12 bristle blossoms, and they're each using 20 kilograms, 20 kilograms of water per cycle, which is essentially 33 grams per second of fresh water. So that's why these aren't running kind of all the time. There they go, they kicked on. And when these things operate, they get quite hot. That's why I have them immersed in oil. And this oil is around 87 degrees here. Over here it's like 80. Let's actually make some abyssalite tile here really quickly. So if we let this run at super speed, the oil will eventually warm up. I don't know how long this would last before it became an issue. Oil boils at 400 degrees. It would take a while, I think, to heat up this oil. Now, I have it encased in abyssalite. If you built something like this down at the bottom of the map, where there is a ton of oil, let's say you dug into a bunch of this oil, you could immerse those aquatuners in there in a large amount of oil, build something like this. I mean, it would take a while to dig out, but once you have exosuits, you can do that. So you've got a giant pool of oil. You could immerse those aquatuners in there, and it would take probably thousands of cycles to heat up the oil. Now, another thing you could do is heat the oil up to, let's say, 100 degrees or 120 degrees, and then actually consume it in a oil refinery, for instance. Consume it, turn it into petroleum, and then pump in new, fresh, cool oil from down below. Or from your slicksters, because these slicksters make oil when they eat carbon dioxide. And they're outputting oil at 25 degrees. So you could pump that 25 degree oil into a tank like this, dump all the heat into it from these aquatuners, and then consume the oil and destroy the heat. So it's pretty common to use things like polluted water. Like in this instance here, I was using polluted water into the sieve. Now I could take this polluted water and cool down machinery with it, dribble it on top of machinery, or put it through an area that's say 60 degrees and kind of dump the heat into it, and then put it into the sieve, and it would destroy the 60-degree polluted water and give out 40-degree fresh water. Now, a less power-hungry way of doing this, using all these aquatuners, would be to take the output of one aquatuner and feed the cooler water back into the aquatuner and basically get a cooling loop going, and then eventually use it. But as you can see, these aren't running all the time, so they're not actually, you don't need 1200 watts times 5 to run this thing. You just need enough battery storage to run them intermittently. So if we put a bunch of smart batteries on here, we can see them fill up. And then when this runs, they'll take a little hit. Oh, they didn't even take a hit. We have so much power. And this isn't even a big power setup. This is only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's only 6 natural gas generators. It's not that big. So that's kind of a non-cheaty way of cooling water. This is kind of a crude setup because I'm doing it in series, but the thing, like I said, you might want to pump in cold oil, and eventually once it gets too hot, pump it out, and you could use regulation for that. Pump it out and destroy it in the oil refinery. So the water that's coming out of that is 26.8 degrees, which is just perfect for bristle blossom. Now I'll show you one other way to cool water. This is not as effective, but you can use the anti-entropy thermo nullifier, which you feed hydrogen. It doesn't use very much. It uses, let's see here, 10 grams per second of hydrogen. And you can generate hydrogen with the electrolyzer. So that's one way of generating the hydrogen that you send to it. I just built a room up here, a fake little room full of hydrogen to do this. And it can even be hot hydrogen that goes into this thing if you're using a Wolframite pipe. So this thing does quite a bit of cooling. I think it's equivalent to about 12 Wheeze Warts. Somewhere between 8 and 14 Wheeze Warts. I don't know the exact number. It says minus 400 watts, but there's some internal math that actually turns it into 80 kilowatts apparently, versus the 12 kilowatts for a Wheeze Wart. So this will cool itself as well as the surrounding area. And I have this room filled with hydrogen at 2,000 grams per tile. And as I said earlier, hydrogen's a really good gas for kind of cooling. It's the best gas for cooling. So this thing is down at, let's see, 10 degrees. And I've got the temp shift plates to kind of spread the coolness out. And then what I'm doing is I'm sending, I think it's 100 grams per second of 95 degree water through this system. So the water's going in at 97 and it's coming out at 12. And the room isn't heating up. Like if we kind of watch the hydrogen, it's at 10.4 and we speed things up massively. It's pretty stable, 10.3. Now if we send more than 100 grams, the equation changes. So let's send, now 100 grams per second of cold water is enough to grow 3 bristle blossoms, which isn't very much. But let's try 200 and see what happens and speed things up. So if we watch the hydrogen, 10.1, 10.2. So it is warming up very, very slowly. And the water that's coming out is no longer as cold. It's coming out at 25 degrees, which is still good enough for bristle blossoms, just barely. So gas cooling is not as effective as liquid cooling. The aquatuner is super powerful, but it does take, 1200 watts. Whereas this thing actually doesn't require any power at all. It's free power, except for the hydrogen that you got to generate. And there's usually 3 of these on the map. I've only ever seen 3. They're kind of hidden in the ice biome. Let's see if we can find one. Okay, here's one here. They're usually hidden in ice, but they're usually a little bit of them is exposed. If you turn on the gas overlay, you can see their input. So there's one hidden away. So not the most effective way to cool, but a decent way. It's good for cooling oxygen. If you set up your oxygen generation close to one of these nullifiers, it's pretty effective. But for cooling liquids, it's not as effective. The reason it's so hard to cool liquids is that they have a high mass. So we're doing like 10 kilograms per bubble here, but one tile of gas only has usually 2 kilograms or less. So it comes down to mass. And a tile of water is 1,000 kilograms. So quite a bit, it's almost 500 times the mass of a normal gas tile. So there's probably lots of other ways to cool water, but these are the ones that I've used in the past. This setup here is super effective at destroying a good portion of the heat. It gets you down from 95 to 40, and then you can use an aquatuner to bring it down to kind of 26 degrees, a single aquatuner. And remember, you only need to cool the water for your food. You don't need to cool it for showers or toilets or a lot of other uses. If let's say like electrolyzers, you can send hot water into those. Food is pretty much the only thing you need cold water for. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about these systems. I've probably missed some ways to do cooling. Wheeze Warts, like I said, are good at cooling. They're essentially a small version of this nullifier, and they're more portable. These things you can't move around. So you can do something similar to this, but you're going to need a lot of Wheeze Warts. So sorry this video was so long, but I wanted to get kind of a lot of different varieties in terms of cooling in. If you enjoy these kind of videos, hit that subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. If you want to hear any other kind of guides, let me know in the comments. I've already done a gas guide, a kind of temperature guide. I'm about to do a slime guide probably after this one, slime and germs guide. So let me know if you want to see any other guides. I'll probably put a link in the description to the playlist that shows all the guides. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.